Hi, I'm Myka. At 28, I thought my biggest problem was my demanding boss at TechFlow Solutions. Then I got laid off on a Tuesday morning, and my sister Jessica burst into laughter when I called her crying. She actually said, "Well, maybe now you'll learn some real responsibility like the rest of us." 6 months later, when her real estate empire crumbled and she lost everything, she expected me to drop everything and save her. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the TechFlow Solutions office felt colder than usual that Tuesday morning in March. I'd been with the company for 3 years, building their social media presence from 12 followers to over 50,000. My campaigns had increased their client engagement by 200%, and I'd just finished presenting a quarterly report that showed record-breaking results. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, finally feeling like I'd found my place in the professional world after struggling through my early 20s. I remember straightening my navy blazer as I walked into the conference room, expecting another strategy meeting about our upcoming product launch. Instead, I found my manager, Mr. Chen, sitting across from someone I didn't recognize, a woman in an expensive gray suit with a leather portfolio in front of her. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the air before a desert thunderstorm here in Phoenix. "Myka, please have a seat," Mr. Chen said, his usual warm smile nowhere to be found. I'd always respected him. He'd been the one to give me a chance when other companies wouldn't even interview someone without a traditional marketing degree. I'd learned everything about digital strategy through online courses and pure determination, and he'd believed in me when few others would. The woman in gray introduced herself as someone from human resources, though I'd never seen her before. Her words came out clinical and rehearsed. Budget cuts. Restructuring. Position elimination. The phrases washed over me like white noise while my mind struggled to process what was happening. 3 years of 60-hour weeks, missed family dinners, skipped vacations to meet deadlines, all of it suddenly meaningless. "We appreciate everything you've contributed to the team," she continued, sliding a packet of papers across the table. "Your last day will be today. Security will escort you to collect your personal items." I stared at the severance agreement, the numbers blurring together. 2 weeks' pay for 3 years of dedication. My hands shook as I tried to focus on the legal language, but all I could think about was my rent payment due next week, my student loan installments, the small emergency fund I'd been slowly building that would now become my lifeline. Mr. Chen looked genuinely uncomfortable, fidgeting with his pen. "Myka, I want you to know this wasn't my decision. If it were up to me—" "But it's not," the HR woman interrupted smoothly. "These decisions come from corporate level. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." As if dismantling someone's career and financial stability could ever be anything but personal. As if the late nights I'd spent perfecting campaigns, the weekends I'd worked to meet impossible deadlines, the relationships I'd sacrificed to prove myself worthy, as if none of that mattered, because some executives in suits had decided my position was expendable. The security escort felt like a walk of shame. My coworkers avoided eye contact as I packed my desk, loading 3 years of my professional life into a cardboard box. My favorite coffee mug, the small succulent plant I'd nursed back to health, the framed photo of my family from last Christmas. Suddenly, these items felt like artifacts from a life that no longer existed. Marcus, my friend from the graphic design team, slipped me a note as I walked past his desk. "We'll keep in touch," he whispered. "This is complete garbage." His support meant everything in that moment, a small reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this corporate wasteland. By 11 a.m., I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, staring at the building where I'd spent more waking hours than in my own apartment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Phoenix sun beat down mercilessly through my windshield, and I felt the first tears starting to come. Not just sadness, but humiliation, fear, the overwhelming uncertainty of what came next. I drove home to my small apartment in Riverside, a modest complex where most of the residents were young professionals like me, people trying to build something from nothing. My one-bedroom unit, with its hand-me-down furniture and thrift store decorations, had always felt cozy, like a sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap. How long could I afford this place? How long before I'd have to give up the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve? The first person I called was Jessica. Despite our complicated relationship, she was still my sister, still family. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd offer some comfort or support during what was clearly the worst professional day of my life. We'd never been particularly close. She was 3 years older and had always seemed to have everything figured out while I stumbled through life making mistakes and learning the hard way. But she was successful, stable, someone who might have advice, or at least sympathy. Jessica had built quite a name for herself in Phoenix real estate. She sold luxury homes in Paradise Valley and Scottsdale, drove a white BMW, and lived in a gorgeous house with granite countertops and a pool. She'd married her college boyfriend Tom right after graduation, and they projected this image of perfect suburban success. Family gatherings always felt like Jessica's stage, where she'd casually mention her latest commission or their upcoming vacation to Europe. My phone rang 3 times before she picked up, and I could hear the familiar sounds of her busy office in the background. "Hey Myka, what's up? I'm kind of in the middle of something." "Jess, I just got laid off," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay composed. "They eliminated my position this morning. I don't know what I'm gonna do." There was a pause, and then something I'll never forget as long as I live. Jessica started laughing. Not a nervous giggle or an uncomfortable chuckle, but genuine laughter, as if I'd just told her the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "Oh my God, Myka," she said between laughs. "Well, maybe now you'll learn some real responsibility like the rest of us. I mean, that social media stuff was never really a serious career anyway, right? Maybe this is the universe telling you to grow up and get a real job." I sat in stunned silence, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my sister's laughter echo through the speaker. The person I'd called for support, for comfort, for any kind of understanding, had just dismissed 3 years of my professional life as if it were a hobby I'd been playing at. "I need this job, Jess," I managed to say. "This isn't funny. I have rent, loans, bills." "Everyone has bills, Myka," she interrupted, her tone shifting to that condescending voice she'd used since we were kids. "Welcome to the adult world. Maybe you should have thought about that before choosing such an unstable career path." Tom and I knew from day one that real estate was secure, that we were building something lasting. Her words hit like physical blows. Here I was in the most vulnerable moment I'd experienced in years, and my own sister was lecturing me about career choices as if I'd deliberately chosen to fail. As if my dedication, my skills, my passion for what I did were somehow less valid because they didn't fit her definition of success. "I can't believe you're saying this to me right now," I whispered, tears finally flowing freely. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Jessica sighed. "Look, I have a showing in 10 minutes. Why don't you call Mom and Dad? Maybe they can help you figure out your next steps. And Myka, maybe consider this an opportunity to finally do something more substantial with your life." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my car with the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what had just happened. The person who should have been my ally, my support system, my family, had just kicked me while I was down. Not only had she refused to offer comfort, she'd actively made me feel worse about an already devastating situation. I called my parents next, hoping for a different response. Mom answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Myka, honey, how are you?" When I explained what had happened, both at work and with Jessica, my mother's response was everything I'd needed to hear. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. That's terrible about your job, and I can't believe Jessica said those things to you. You've worked so hard, and what you do is absolutely a real career. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Dad got on the line too, offering practical support. They could help with rent for a few months if needed, and Dad had some connections in the marketing world who might know about openings. For the first time since leaving the TechFlow office, I felt like I could breathe again. Don't take Jessica's words to heart, Mom said gently. You know how she gets sometimes. She doesn't always think before she speaks. But I knew this was more than just thoughtless words. This was a pattern I'd been seeing for years but had never fully acknowledged. Jessica's success had always come with a side of superiority, as if my different path somehow diminished her achievements. She needed to be the golden child, the one who had everything figured out, and my struggles seemed to validate her choices while highlighting what she saw as my failures. That evening, I sat in my apartment going through my finances, trying to calculate how long my savings would last. The numbers were sobering. Even with my parents' help, I had maybe 3 months before things became truly desperate. I updated my resume, started browsing job boards, and began the humbling process of explaining to potential employers why I was suddenly available. Marcus texted me around dinner time. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? I heard some things at work today that you should know about. We met at the coffee corner the next morning, a little cafe near my apartment that had become my temporary office for job hunting. Marcus looked uncomfortable as he stirred his latte, clearly struggling with whether to share what he'd learned. Look, I probably shouldn't tell you this, he began, but I overheard Mr. Chen talking to someone from corporate yesterday. Your position wasn't eliminated because of budget cuts, Myka. They're hiring someone to replace you. The CEO's nephew just graduated college, and they needed to make room for him. The betrayal hit me like a physical punch. Bad enough to lose my job, but to discover it was all a lie, that my 3 years of hard work and dedication had been casually discarded to make space for nepotism. It was almost too much to bear. I'd been naive enough to believe their corporate speak about restructuring and budget constraints, when the reality was much simpler and more insulting. There's more, Marcus continued reluctantly. The nephew doesn't have any experience in social media or marketing. They're planning to have him shadow the team for a few months to learn the basics. Basically, they're paying someone with no qualifications to learn how to do the job you were already doing perfectly. I spent the rest of that week in a haze of anger and disbelief, sending out resumes and trying to explain to potential employers why I was suddenly available without revealing the bitter truth about nepotism and corporate lies. The job market was tougher than I'd expected. Many companies wanted someone with a traditional marketing degree, despite my proven track record and portfolio of successful campaigns. David, my boyfriend of 8 months, was incredibly supportive during this time. He worked as a teacher at a local elementary school, so he understood financial uncertainty and the stress of feeling undervalued professionally. He'd come over most evenings with takeout and encouragement, helping me practice interview skills and reviewing my portfolio. You're incredibly talented, Myka, he'd remind me when I started spiraling into self-doubt. One company's stupidity doesn't define your worth or your abilities. The right opportunity will come along. His faith in me meant everything, especially when my own confidence was shattered. David had seen my work, had watched me troubleshoot campaign problems and develop creative solutions. He knew my dedication and skills were real, regardless of what Jessica or corporate executives might think. 2 weeks after losing my job, I finally heard back from my sister. She called on a Sunday evening while I was meal prepping for the week, trying to stretch my grocery budget as far as possible. Hey, Myka, she said, her tone casual, as if our last conversation had never happened. How's the job search going? It's going, I replied carefully, not wanting to give her any ammunition for more criticism. Well, I'm sure you'll find something soon, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly concerned either way. Actually, I'm calling because I wanted to invite you to my open house next Sunday. I'm listing this gorgeous property in Paradise Valley and I thought you might like to see it. Plus, there will be some influential people there, maybe good for networking. The invitation felt like salt in a wound. Here she was, casually showcasing her success while I struggled to find my next opportunity. The subtext was clear. Come see what real success looks like. Meet people with actual careers. Maybe learn something from your accomplished sister. I don't think that's a good idea, Jess, I said quietly. Why not? It could be good for you to get out, meet some people. You can't just sit around feeling sorry for yourself forever. There it was again. The implication that my situation was somehow my own fault. That I was choosing to wallow rather than actively working to improve my circumstances. She had no idea about the dozens of applications I'd submitted, the interviews I'd scheduled, the networking events I'd attended despite my limited budget. "I'm not feeling sorry for myself," I said, my voice sharper than intended. "I'm dealing with a difficult situation and trying to find a new job. Some support would be nice instead of lectures about getting out and networking." "There's no need to get defensive," Jessica sighed. "I'm just trying to help. But if you want to handle this all by yourself, that's your choice." She hung up again, leaving me frustrated and hurt. This was Jessica's pattern: offer help that wasn't really helpful, then make me feel guilty for not accepting it graciously. Her version of support always came with strings attached, usually involving me acknowledging her superior judgment or position in life. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the job search with renewed determination. I expanded my skill set, taking online courses in data analytics and SEO optimization. I volunteered to help a local nonprofit with their social media strategy, both to stay sharp and to add current experience to my resume. Slowly, I started getting callbacks and second interviews. David suggested I talk to someone about the stress and anxiety I was experiencing. "It's not just about the job, Myka," he observed gently. "You seem really affected by Jessica's reaction. Maybe it would help to talk to someone professional about family dynamics." He was right, though I was initially resistant to the idea. I'd always prided myself on handling problems independently, but this situation had shaken me more deeply than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just about unemployment. It was about feeling betrayed by the person who should have been my strongest supporter. Sarah Martinez was a counselor who specialized in family relationships and career transitions. Her office was warm and comfortable, with soft lighting and plants everywhere. During our first session, I found myself telling her not just about the job loss, but about years of complicated interactions with Jessica, the way she'd always made me feel like my choices were somehow inferior to hers. "It sounds like you're dealing with more than just unemployment stress," Sarah observed. "Losing a job is difficult enough without feeling like your family doesn't support or understand your career path. Can you tell me more about your relationship with your sister?" As I talked about our history, patterns became clearer. Jessica had always positioned herself as the responsible one, the successful one, the one who made smart choices. My different path, the creative career, the smaller apartment, the focus on passion over immediate financial gain, seemed to threaten that narrative somehow. My struggles validated her choices, while my successes made her defensive. "Some people need to maintain their position as the successful one in the family," Sarah explained. "When that role feels threatened, they might unconsciously undermine others to preserve their status. It doesn't make it okay, but it might explain some of her reactions." These sessions helped me realize that Jessica's dismissive attitude toward my career wasn't really about my career at all. It was about maintaining a family dynamic where she remained the golden child, the one with everything figured out. My job loss hadn't just been an opportunity for her to offer support, it had been confirmation of her superior life choices. After 6 weeks of searching, I finally landed an interview with a growing startup called Phoenix Digital Solutions. They were looking for someone to head their social media and content marketing department, and they were more interested in results than degrees. The interview went incredibly well. I presented case studies from my TechFlow campaigns, demonstrated my understanding of current platforms and trends, and connected with the team immediately. They offered me the position the next day, with a salary 15% higher than what I'd been making at TechFlow. The work would be more challenging and creative, with opportunities for growth and leadership I'd never had before. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again, confident, capable, excited about the future. The first person I called was David, who was teaching but texted back immediately, with celebration emojis and promises of a fancy dinner to celebrate. My parents were thrilled, Mom crying happy tears over the phone while Dad talked about how proud he was of my persistence and determination. Then I called Jessica, hoping that my good news might reset our relationship somehow. Maybe with the crisis over, she could return to being the supportive sister I remembered from childhood. "That's great, Myka," she said when I told her about the new job. "What kind of company is it?" "I haven't heard of Phoenix Digital Solutions." "It's a startup," I explained, describing the role and the growth opportunities. "They're really innovative, and I'll have a lot more creative control over campaigns and strategy." A startup, Jessica repeated, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice. Well, I hope it's more stable than your last position. You know how those smaller companies can be. Here today, gone tomorrow. Maybe you should have looked for something more established, more secure. Even in my moment of triumph, she couldn't just be happy for me. There had to be a qualifier, a reason to worry, a suggestion that I'd made the wrong choice again. I realized then that nothing I accomplished would ever be enough for Jessica to see me as successful in my own right. She would always find ways to diminish my achievements to preserve her own sense of superiority. It's a good opportunity, Jess, I said firmly. I'm excited about it. Of course, she said quickly. I'm happy for you, I just worry, you know. I want you to have security and stability. Maybe once you're settled there, you can start looking at houses. Tom and I could help you find something nice. Build some equity instead of throwing money away on rent. There it was. Another subtle dig at my choices. Another implication that I wasn't managing my life properly. Even my housing situation, which worked perfectly for my lifestyle and budget, needed her correction and guidance. I started my new job on a Monday morning in May, and it was everything I'd hoped for, and more. The team was young and energetic, the projects were challenging and creative, and my boss, Maria, actually valued my input and expertise. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The company was growing rapidly, and within 2 months I was managing a team of 3 junior marketers and overseeing campaigns for major clients throughout the Southwest. My strategies were producing exceptional results, and Maria made it clear that there were opportunities for promotion and increased responsibility as the company expanded. David and I grew closer during this period too. He'd been there for me during my darkest professional moment, and seeing me rebuild and thrive seemed to strengthen his respect and affection. We started talking about moving in together, maybe getting a bigger place that could accommodate both our needs and career goals. Life was good. Better than good, actually. I was professionally fulfilled, financially stable, and personally happy in ways I hadn't been before losing my job at TechFlow. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us redirect us toward better opportunities, and I was grateful for the painful detour that had led me to where I belonged. Jessica and I maintained distant but polite contact during this period. She'd occasionally text about family events or holidays, and I'd respond appropriately, but the warmth that had once existed between us was gone. I'd learned not to share details about my work or personal life, knowing they'd be met with subtle criticism or attempts to offer unsolicited advice. It was during this peaceful period that everything changed, and the tables turned in ways I never could have anticipated. October brought the first hints that Jessica's perfect world wasn't as stable as it appeared. I was working late at TechFlow Solutions, fine-tuning a campaign for a luxury resort client, when my phone buzzed with a text from our mutual friend Emma. Emma had been Jessica's college roommate and maid of honor, but we'd stayed friendly over the years despite Jessica's tendency to monopolize relationships. Have you talked to your sister lately? Something's going on with her real estate business. Tom looked really stressed at the grocery store yesterday and wouldn't make eye contact. I stared at the message, uncertain how to respond. Jessica and I barely spoke beyond holiday pleasantries anymore, and I had no idea what might be happening in her professional life. Part of me felt a twinge of concern. She was still my sister, after all, but another part remembered her laughter when I'd lost my job, her dismissive comments about my career choices, her inability to offer support when I'd needed it most. I texted Emma back asking what she'd heard, but her response was vague. Just rumors around town. You know how Paradise Valley can be with gossip. Maybe nothing, but I thought you should know people are talking. The Phoenix real estate market had been booming for years, with luxury properties in Paradise Valley and Scottsdale selling for record prices. Jessica had ridden that wave expertly, building a reputation as one of the top agents in the area. Her social media was constantly filled with photos of million-dollar listings, satisfied clients, and glamorous open house events. From the outside, her business appeared to be thriving more than ever. I decided not to reach out to Jessica directly. We'd established a pattern of minimal contact, and suddenly calling to ask about potential business problems would seem strange. Besides, Emma's information was secondhand gossip, and Jessica had always been private about the details of her work. If there were real problems, surely she'd reach out to family for support. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me during my lunch break with unexpected news. "You're not gonna believe this, but guess who just applied for a position at TechFlow? Your sister Jessica. I saw her resume come through HR this morning." My sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard. Jessica applying for a corporate job made no sense whatsoever. She'd built her entire identity around being a successful real estate entrepreneur. She'd lectured me countless times about the security and prestige of her chosen career path. Why would she suddenly be looking for employment at a mid-level marketing company? "Are you sure it was her?" I asked, though I knew Marcus wouldn't mistake something like that. "Positive. Jessica Morgan, residential real estate specialist, looking for opportunities in client relations or business development. I recognized her photo from your family pictures on social media." I spent the rest of the afternoon distracted, trying to focus on my work while my mind raced with questions. Had Jessica's business hit a rough patch? Was she looking to diversify her income streams? Or was this a sign of something more serious happening in her professional life? That evening, David found me pacing around my apartment, unable to concentrate on anything. "What's going on?" "You've been weird since lunch." I explained about Emma's text and Marcus's call, watching David's expression grow more concerned as I talked. He'd witnessed enough of my family dynamics to understand the complicated emotions this situation was stirring up. "Have you considered just calling her?" he suggested gently. "I know things have been tense between you two, but if she's struggling professionally, maybe this is a chance to be the supportive sister she wasn't for you." His suggestion made sense logically, but emotionally I felt conflicted. Part of me wanted to be the bigger person, to offer the support I'd wished for during my own crisis. But another part of me remembered the humiliation of her laughter, the way she'd dismissed my struggles as character failures, her inability to provide even basic sympathy during my lowest moment. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I admitted. What if she just sees it as me gloating or trying to interfere? What if she responds the same way she did when I needed help? David sat beside me on the couch, taking my hand. "Then at least you'll know you tried. You can't control how she responds, but you can control whether you show up with compassion." Before I could lose my nerve, I texted Jessica a simple message. "Hey, hope you're doing well. Want to grab coffee sometime this week? It's been too long since we've really talked." Her response came hours later, much longer than her usual immediate replies. "Things are pretty busy right now, but maybe in a few weeks when my schedule calms down." The deflection confirmed that something was definitely wrong. The Jessica I knew never turned down opportunities to showcase her success or share details about her thriving business. Her avoidance suggested she was dealing with problems she didn't want to discuss, especially not with me. I decided to give her space while keeping my ears open for any additional information. Emma texted occasionally with small updates. Jessica had missed a few social events. Tom seemed withdrawn at their country club. Their usual extravagant lifestyle appeared to be scaled back slightly. Nothing dramatic, but a pattern of small changes that suggested underlying stress. Meanwhile, my own life continued to flourish in ways that felt almost surreal compared to my situation 6 months earlier. Phoenix Digital Solutions landed a major contract with a national retailer, and Maria promoted me to Senior Marketing Director with a substantial salary increase and stock options. The company was expanding into new markets, and I was being considered for regional management positions that would take my career to levels I'd never imagined possible. David and I found a beautiful apartment in a trendy part of downtown Phoenix, with exposed brick walls, huge windows, and space for a proper home office. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was building something substantial and lasting. The contrast with my sister's apparent struggles created complicated emotions I wasn't sure how to process. November brought more concrete evidence that Jessica's business was in serious trouble. I was having dinner with my parents when Dad mentioned receiving an unusual phone call from Tom, Jessica's husband. "He was asking about our financial advisor," Dad explained, looking puzzled. "Wanted to know about investment strategies and retirement planning. Seems strange, since they've always handled their own finances and done quite well for themselves." Mom frowned, setting down her fork. Now that you mention it, Jessica has been canceling our usual lunch dates. She always says she's too busy with work, but her tone seems different, more stressed. Have either of you tried talking to her directly? I asked, though I suspected they'd get the same deflection I had. She doesn't really share details about her business, Mom replied. You know how private she can be about work. She likes to keep family and professional life separate. This was true, but I also knew Jessica's tendency to share good news enthusiastically while hiding anything that might suggest imperfection. If she was struggling, she'd go to great lengths to maintain the appearance of success, especially with family members who might worry or offer unwanted advice. The truth finally emerged in December, though not from Jessica directly. I was at a networking event for Phoenix marketing professionals when I overheard a conversation between two real estate agents discussing recent market developments. Did you hear about Jessica Morgan from Paradise Luxury Properties? One of them said. Apparently she's being investigated for some kind of financial irregularities. Something about client escrow accounts and delayed settlements. My blood ran cold. Escrow account problems were serious business in real estate, potentially involving regulatory violations and legal consequences. If Jessica was being investigated by the State Real Estate Commission, her license and entire career could be at risk. I excused myself from the conversation and went outside to call Emma, my heart pounding as I waited for her to answer. Emma, I need to ask you something. Confidential, I said when she picked up. Have you heard anything specific about Jessica having legal or professional problems? There was a long pause before Emma sighed heavily. I was wondering when someone in your family would find out. Yes, there are serious problems, Myka. I've been debating whether to tell you, but Jessica made me promise not to say anything to anyone. What kind of problems? She's being investigated by the state licensing board for mishandling client funds. Apparently she was using money from one transaction to cover shortfalls in others. Sort of a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. It worked fine when the market was hot and transactions were closing quickly. But when things slowed down this fall, the whole system collapsed. I felt sick to my stomach. What Emma was describing sounded like fraud, or at minimum serious professional misconduct, that could result in criminal charges. This wasn't just a business downturn or market correction. This was my sister potentially facing legal consequences that could destroy her career and reputation permanently. How bad is it? I asked quietly. Bad. She's already lost several major clients, and word is spreading through the luxury market. Tom is apparently trying to liquidate assets to cover the shortfalls, but they're looking at serious financial problems even if she avoids criminal charges. And Myka? She's been drinking. A lot. Tom confided in my husband that he's worried about her mental health. The picture Emma painted was devastating. Jessica's entire identity was built around being the successful sister, the one who'd made smart choices and built a stable, prosperous life. To have that collapse so spectacularly, especially in such a public way within Phoenix's tight-knit luxury real estate community, would be devastating for someone with her personality and ego. Why hasn't she reached out to family for help? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Pride, Emma said simply. You know Jessica. She can't stand the idea of anyone seeing her as less than perfect. She's been trying to fix this on her own for months, but it just kept getting worse. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything I'd learned. My sister, who had laughed at my job loss and lectured me about career stability, was facing professional destruction that made my temporary unemployment look trivial by comparison. The irony was almost too perfect, except there was no satisfaction in it, only complicated grief for the family relationship that had been damaged beyond repair. David found me drinking coffee at dawn, still in my pajamas, and clearly haven't slept. You look terrible. What's going on? I told him everything Emma had shared, watching his expression grow more serious as the scope of Jessica's problems became clear. This isn't just about losing a job, I concluded. This could be criminal fraud charges, bankruptcy, losing their house, everything. Are you going to reach out to her? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew how conflicted I felt about that possibility. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me thinks I should be the bigger person, offer support the way she couldn't for me. But another part of me is still angry about how she treated me. And honestly, a small part of me thinks maybe this is karma catching up with her. That's understandable, David said carefully. She hurt you when you needed her most. You don't owe her anything just because you're related. But even as he said it, I could see the concern in his eyes. David was fundamentally a kind person who believed in helping others when possible. While he understood my anger toward Jessica, he also knew that holding on to resentment ultimately hurt me more than it hurt her. The decision was taken out of my hands 3 days before Christmas. I was working late, putting finishing touches on a year-end campaign analysis, when my phone rang. Tom's name appeared on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. Jessica's husband and I had always been friendly but never particularly close, and he'd never called me directly before. "Myka, I'm sorry to bother you," Tom said, his voice strained and exhausted. "I know things have been complicated between you and Jessica, but I didn't know who else to call." My heart started racing. "What's wrong? Is she okay?" "She's been arrested," Tom said, the words coming out in beau. A rush. The state attorney general's office filed charges this afternoon. Wire fraud, theft, embezzlement. It's serious, Myka. Really serious. I sat down heavily, feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. Despite knowing about the investigation, hearing that actual criminal charges had been filed made everything suddenly real and terrifying. "What do you need from me?" I asked, surprised by how quickly I'd moved past my own hurt feelings to focus on practical matters. "I don't know," Tom admitted. "I've been trying to handle everything myself, but I'm in over my head. The lawyers, the bail money, the media attention, it's all happening so fast. Jessica won't even talk to me properly. She just keeps saying she's ruined everything, and that we'd all be better off without her." The last part sent a chill through me. "Tom, is she talking about hurting herself?" "I don't think so, but she's not in a good place mentally. She's been drinking heavily for weeks, barely eating, not sleeping. Today when they arrested her, she just seemed to shut down completely. Like she'd been expecting it but had no plan for what to do when it actually happened." I found myself asking questions I'd never expected to voice. What can I do to help? Do you need me to call my parents? Should I come over? Would you? Tom's relief was palpable. "I know she doesn't deserve it after how she treated you, but she's still your sister. And honestly, I could use someone else who knows her to help figure out what to do next." An hour later, I was driving through Paradise Valley, toward the house Jessica and Tom had bought 3 years earlier, a sprawling ranch-style home with mountain views and a 3-car garage. I'd only been there a few times for family gatherings, and it had always felt like a showcase for their success rather than a warm family home. Tonight, the house looked different. Several windows were dark, the usually immaculate landscaping was overgrown, and there were no cars in the circular driveway, except Tom's sedan. The white BMW Jessica had been so proud of was nowhere to be seen, probably repossessed or sold to cover legal expenses. Tom met me at the front door, and I was shocked by his appearance. The confident, successful businessman I'd known for years looked haggard and defeated. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Thank you for coming," he said, ushering me inside. "I know this situation is complicated for you." The interior of the house reflected the same decline as Tom's appearance. The furniture was still expensive and tasteful, but there were empty spaces where artwork used to hang, probably sold to raise cash. Boxes were stacked in corners, suggesting preparations for a move or liquidation of assets. "Where is she now?" I asked, looking around the eerily quiet house. "Upstairs in our bedroom. She made bail this afternoon, but she's barely spoken since we got home. Just keeps staring out the window or at her phone, reading news articles about herself." The media attention explained the drawn curtains and general atmosphere of siege. Jessica's arrest would be big news in Phoenix, especially in the luxury real estate community where her name had been prominent for years. The fall from grace was about as public and humiliating as possible. "What are the lawyers saying about her chances?" I asked, dreading the answer. Tom ran his hands through his hair, looking older than his 31 years. "Not good. The evidence is apparently pretty clear that she was moving client money around inappropriately. Her defense attorney thinks the best-case scenario is a plea bargain that would involve some jail time and restitution payments. Worst case, she could be looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The numbers hit me like a physical blow. My sister, who 6 months ago had been laughing at my temporary unemployment, was now facing the possibility of a decade in prison. The magnitude of her downfall was almost incomprehensible. "Tom, can I ask you something honestly?" I said. "How long has this been going on?" "The financial problems, I mean." He sank into one of their leather armchairs, looking defeated. "Longer than I realized, apparently." Jessica had been handling all the business finances, and I trusted her completely. It wasn't until this fall that I started seeing signs. Something was wrong. Late payments on the mortgage, credit card bills piling up, her being secretive about client transactions. "Did you try to talk to her about it?" "I tried, but you know how Jessica is when she doesn't want to discuss something." She kept saying everything was fine, that it was just a temporary cash flow issue while some big deals closed. I wanted to believe her because the alternative was too scary to consider. I understood that impulse. Jessica had always been so confident, so certain of her success, that questioning her judgment felt almost impossible. She projected an image of competence that made others hesitant to challenge her decisions, even when those decisions were leading toward disaster. "Can I talk to her?" I asked, though I wasn't sure what I would say. Tom nodded toward the staircase. "End of the hall, master bedroom. But Myka, just be prepared. She's not the Jessica you remember. This whole situation has broken something in her." I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding with each step. What do you say to someone who laughed at your lowest moment, when they're now facing their own destruction? How do you offer support to someone who couldn't provide it when you needed it most? How do you separate family loyalty from personal hurt when both emotions are pulling you in different directions? The bedroom door was partially open, and I could see Jessica sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing the clothes she'd been arrested in earlier that day. Her usually perfect blonde hair was tangled and unwashed, her makeup smeared from crying, her posture defeated in a way I'd never seen before. I knocked softly on the door frame. "Jess? It's Myka. Can I come in?" She looked up, and the expression on her face nearly broke my heart. Gone was the confident, successful sister who had always seemed to have everything figured out. In her place was someone broken and frightened, someone who looked like she'd lost everything that mattered to her and had no idea how to move forward. "Myka," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying, "what are you doing here?" "Tom called me," I said, stepping into the room carefully. "He's worried about you." "We all are." Jessica laughed, but it was nothing like the cruel laughter I remembered from our phone call months earlier. This was bitter and self-deprecating, the sound of someone who had recognized the complete collapse of everything they'd built. "Worried about me," she repeated. "That's rich." The successful sister is worried about the fraud who's going to prison, how the tables have turned, right? I sat down on the bed beside her, maintaining some distance but close enough to talk quietly. "This isn't about tables turning, Jess. This is about you being in serious trouble and needing help." "Help," she said, staring at her hands. "Like the help I gave you when you lost your job? Like how supportive I was when you needed family?" At least she remembered. At least she understood that our last real conversation had been a betrayal of everything family should represent. But sitting there looking at her devastation, I found that my anger had been replaced by something more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that holding on to resentment while she faced potential prison time served no purpose. "That's between us to work through later," I said carefully. "Right now, the priority is figuring out how to get you through this crisis." Jessica turned to look at me directly for the first time since I'd entered the room. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you help me after what I did to you? Why would you be here when I couldn't be there for you?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself during the drive over. The honest answer was complicated. Part family obligation, part basic human decency, part recognition that none of us are perfect and we all need grace sometimes, even when we haven't earned it. "Because that's what family is supposed to do," I said finally. "Support each other during the worst times, not just the good ones. I wish you had understood that when I needed it, but maybe I can be better than that." For the first time since I'd arrived, Jessica's composed facade cracked completely. She started crying, not the careful, controlled tears of someone trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose entire world had collapsed. "I've ruined everything, Myka," she said between sobs. "My career, our finances, Tom's reputation, our future, everything. And the worst part is, I did it to myself. I made these choices. I thought I was smart enough to manage the risk, but I was just greedy and stupid." Hearing Jessica acknowledge her responsibility was startling. Throughout our lives, she'd rarely admitted fault or accepted accountability for negative outcomes. Her willingness to own her mistakes suggested that this crisis had forced a level of self-reflection she'd never engaged in before. "What happened?" I asked gently. "How did it start?" "Small things at first," Jessica said, wiping her eyes with a tissue from the bedside table. "A client's funding fell through at the last minute, and I used money from another transaction to cover the shortfall temporarily. It was supposed to be just for a few days until the bank released the replacement funds. But it didn't work out that way. The replacement funds were delayed, then the second client had their own financing issues, and suddenly I was juggling money between multiple accounts just to keep transactions moving. Each time I told myself it was temporary, that I'd straighten everything out as soon as the next big commission came in. It was a classic spiral, small compromises leading to bigger ones, each decision making the next one seem more necessary and reasonable. Jessica had gotten trapped in a system of her own creation, always one transaction away from solving her problems, but never quite getting there. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Total? About $400,000. The number hung in the air between us like a bomb. "Some of it I've been able to repay, but there's still about $250,000 outstanding. Tom's trying to liquidate our assets, but even if we sell everything, we'll be short." The scope of the financial damage was staggering. Even if Jessica avoided prison time, the restitution requirements would bankrupt them completely. Their house, their cars, their savings, everything would have to go just to partially satisfy the debt to her former clients. "What do the lawyers think is going to happen?" I asked. "Best case scenario, I pled guilty to reduced charges, serve 18 to 24 months in minimum security prison, and pay full restitution over time. Worst case, I go to trial and get convicted on all charges, which could mean 8 to 10 years in federal prison." The reality of potential prison time made everything feel surreal. My sister, who had always been so concerned with appearances and social status, facing years in a federal penitentiary. The woman who had lectured me about career stability, now looking at the complete destruction of everything she'd built. "Have you talked to Mom and Dad about this?" I asked. Jessica shook her head. "How can I? How do I tell them their successful daughter is actually a criminal who's going to prison? How do I explain that everything they've been proud of was built on fraud and lies?" "They're going to find out anyway," I pointed out gently. "This is going to be in the news, and people will be talking about it. Better that they hear it from you than read about it online or hear it from neighbors." The thought of media coverage clearly terrified Jessica even more than the legal consequences. Her entire identity had been built around public success and social status. Having her failures exposed for everyone to see represented a different kind of prison sentence, one that would follow her long after any jail time was completed. "I can't face them," Jessica whispered. "I can't see the disappointment in their eyes. I can't handle them knowing what I really am." "What you really are is someone who made serious mistakes," I said firmly. That doesn't erase everything else about you or make you worthless as a person. But you have to stop hiding from this situation and start dealing with it head on. We talked for another hour, and slowly I began to understand the full scope of what Jessica was facing. Beyond the legal and financial consequences, she was dealing with the complete collapse of her identity and self-worth. Everything she'd used to define herself, professional success, financial security, social status, had been stripped away, leaving her with no foundation for moving forward. When I finally left their house that night, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely clear about what needed to happen next. Jessica was going to need more support than Tom could provide alone, and despite our complicated history, she was still family. The question was whether I was strong enough to be the person she needed while protecting my own emotional well-being. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day making phone calls and researching options. Criminal defense attorneys, financial advisors, therapists who specialized in addiction and crisis counseling. Jessica was going to need professional help in multiple areas if she had any chance of surviving this situation intact. I also called my parents and asked them to meet me for dinner that evening. They deserved to know what was happening before they found out through other channels, and Jessica was going to need their support too, even if she couldn't ask for it herself. The conversation with Mom and Dad was one of the hardest I'd ever had. Watching their faces as I explained Jessica's arrest, the criminal charges, the financial devastation, it was like watching their understanding of their older daughter completely reshape in real time. "How did we not know?" Mom asked, tears streaming down her face. "How did she hide something this serious for so long?" "She's always been private about her business," Dad replied, though he looked shaken. "And we trusted her judgment. Maybe we should have asked more questions, been more involved." "This isn't your fault," I assured them. "Jessica made these choices as an adult. But she's going to need our support now more than ever, even if she can't admit it yet." We talked about practical matters, legal representation, financial planning, media management. But mostly, we just sat together processing the shock of learning that our family's success story had actually been a carefully constructed house of cards that was now collapsing spectacularly. As I drove home that night, I realized that the next few months would test all of us in ways we'd never imagined. Jessica's crisis would force our family to confront dynamics and patterns that had been building for years. And I would have to decide whether I was strong enough to be the sister Jessica had never been to me, even knowing she might not appreciate or reciprocate that support. The girl who had lost her job 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more certain of her own worth. The question now was whether that strength would be enough to help pull my family through the storm that was just beginning. The morning Jessica's story broke in the Phoenix Business Journal, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Maria, my boss at Phoenix Digital Solutions, called first with a heads up that reporters might contact me for comments about my sister's case. Then came calls from former colleagues, distant relatives, and even a few journalists who had somehow gotten my number. "Local real estate agent charged with wire fraud in $1 million scheme," read the headline, accompanied by Jessica's professional headshot from Better Days. The article detailed the charges, the amount of money involved, and quotes from the state attorney general's office about protecting consumers from predatory practices in the real estate industry. Seeing my sister's name associated with words like fraud and embezzlement in print made everything feel more real and more devastating. I drove to Jessica and Tom's house that morning to find 3 news vans parked across the street and reporters camping out on the sidewalk. The once pristine Paradise Valley neighborhood had become a media circus, with cameras pointing at every car that entered or left their circular driveway. I had to park 2 blocks away and walk through a neighbor's backyard to avoid the journalists stationed at the front door. Tom let me in through the garage, looking even more exhausted than he had the night before. "It's been like this since 5 a.m., he said, gesturing toward the front windows where camera flashes were visible through the closed blinds. "Jessica won't come downstairs. She's convinced everyone in Phoenix knows her face now, and she'll never be able to show herself in public again." The media attention was exactly what Jessica had feared most. Her entire identity had been built around public success and social recognition within Phoenix's luxury real estate community. Now that same community was watching her professional and personal destruction play out in real time, with every detail of her failures being dissected in newspapers and online forums. I found Jessica in the guest bedroom this time, having apparently moved out of the master suite to avoid the windows that faced the street where reporters were gathered. She was scrolling through news websites on her laptop, reading every article and comment about her case with the obsessive focus of someone picking at a wound. "You shouldn't be reading that stuff," I said, sitting down beside her on the bed. "I need to know what people are saying," Jessica replied without looking up from the screen. "I need to understand how bad this really is." "It's not going to help you heal or move forward," I pointed out. "You're just torturing yourself." "Good," she said bitterly. "I deserve to be tortured. I deserve every horrible thing people are writing about me." The self-hatred in her voice was alarming. Jessica had always been proud to the point of arrogance, someone who rarely acknowledged fault or accepted criticism. This complete reversal suggested she was in a much darker psychological space than I had initially realized. The woman who had laughed at my job loss was now convinced she deserved punishment for her own failures. "Jessica, have you eaten anything today?" I asked, noticing the untouched breakfast tray Tom had apparently brought up earlier. "I'm not hungry." "When was the last time you ate a real meal?" She finally looked up from the laptop, and I was shocked by her appearance in daylight. Her eyes were bloodshot and sunken, her skin had a grayish pallor, and she'd clearly lost significant weight over the past few weeks. The successful real estate agent was disappearing before my eyes, replaced by someone who looked physically and emotionally broken. "I don't remember," she admitted. "Food tastes like nothing. Everything tastes like nothing." I recognized the signs of clinical depression from my own struggles during unemployment, though Jessica's situation was obviously much more severe. She wasn't just dealing with career setbacks. She was facing potential prison time, complete financial ruin, and the public destruction of her reputation. The psychological weight of that combination would be crushing for anyone, but for someone whose entire self-worth was tied to external success, it was potentially devastating. "We need to get you some professional help," I said carefully. "A therapist who specializes in crisis counseling. Maybe someone who has experience with legal situations." "What's the point?" Jessica said, turning back to her laptop. "I'm going to prison anyway. Therapy isn't going to change that. Prison isn't certain, and even if it happens, it's not permanent. You need to start thinking about how to survive this and rebuild afterward." "Rebuild with what?" she asked harshly. "My career is over. My reputation is destroyed. We're going to lose everything we own. What exactly am I supposed to rebuild from?" It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a good answer for. Jessica's downfall was so complete that starting over would mean literally beginning from nothing. No career, no savings, no professional network, possibly no freedom for months or years. The challenge of rebuilding from that level of devastation would require enormous psychological strength and resilience. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Saw the news? How are you holding up? Need anything?" The simple message reminded me that I had a support system and a life outside of this crisis. Whatever happened with Jessica's situation, I would still have my job, my relationship, my own future to look forward to. Jessica, by contrast, was facing the possibility that everything she'd built would be stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the consequences of her choices. "Jessica, I want to help you through this," I said, putting my phone away. "But you have to want to help yourself too. You can't just give up and wait for everything to get worse." "Why?" she asked, finally closing the laptop. "Why would you want to help me? I wasn't there for you when you needed support. I laughed at your problems and lectured you about responsibility. Why would you do for me what I couldn't do for you?" The question hung between us, heavy with the memory of her cruel response to my job loss. She was right. She hadn't been there for me. She had dismissed my struggles and made me feel worse during an already difficult time. By any logical measure, I owed her nothing. "Because that's not who I want to be," I said finally. "I don't want to be someone who kicks family when they're down, even if they did it to me first. And because despite everything, you're still my sister. Jessica started crying again, but these tears seemed different from the night before. Less desperate, more grateful. I don't deserve your help, Myka. I really don't. Maybe not, I agreed. But I'm offering it anyway, with conditions. She looked up, surprised by the qualification. You have to stop wallowing, I continued. You have to eat, shower, get dressed, and start actively participating in your own defense and recovery. You have to see a therapist and follow their recommendations. And you have to be honest with me about everything. No more lies, no more hiding important information. And if I can't do those things, then I walk away, I said firmly. I'll still love you as my sister, but I won't enable self-destruction or watch you drag our entire family down with you. The boundaries felt necessary, both for Jessica's recovery and for my own emotional protection. I'd learned from my job loss experience that helping someone required their active participation. Support couldn't be forced on someone who wasn't willing to accept it constructively. Jessica nodded slowly. Okay, I'll try. Trying isn't enough, I said. You have to commit. This is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done, and halfway measures won't work. I commit, she said, though her voice was shaky. I commit to working on this. The next few days established a routine that would define the following weeks. I worked my regular schedule at TechFlow Solutions, then spent evenings at Jessica and Tom's house, helping coordinate legal meetings, medical appointments, and the ongoing process of liquidating assets to cover restitution payments. Jessica's criminal defense attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Santos, was cautiously optimistic about negotiating a plea agreement that would minimize jail time in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. The key was demonstrating that Jessica understood the severity of her actions and was committed to making things right with her former clients. The prosecution is more interested in recovering the stolen money than in making an example of your sister, Rebecca explained during a meeting at her downtown office. If we can show good faith efforts to repay everyone and genuine remorse for her actions, we might be able to avoid the worst-case scenarios. The financial reality was sobering, but manageable with careful planning. Tom's 401k, their joint savings, and proceeds from selling their house and cars would cover most of the outstanding restitution. They'd also need to liquidate Jessica's jewelry, art collection, and other valuable possessions. But the math suggested they could satisfy the court's requirements without declaring bankruptcy. What about afterwards? Tom asked. When the legal situation is resolved, what then? Rebecca's expression grew more serious. Jessica will have a felony conviction on her record, which will make employment challenging. Her real estate license is permanently revoked, obviously, and most financial services positions will be off limits due to the fraud conviction. She'll need to think about alternative career paths that don't require background checks or professional licensing. The conversation was a harsh reminder that Jessica's consequences would extend far beyond any potential jail time. Even after serving her sentence and paying restitution, she'd face years of limited employment options and social stigma. The privileged life she'd built would be gone permanently, replaced by the daily challenges of rebuilding from nothing with significant disadvantages. Jessica surprised me by handling these meetings better than I'd expected. She asked intelligent questions, took notes, and seemed to genuinely engage with the process of planning for her future. The woman who had been catatonic with despair just days earlier was slowly emerging from her depression and starting to think practically about survival. The therapy sessions were more difficult. Dr. Angela Rodriguez specialized in counseling for people facing legal crises, and she didn't allow Jessica to wallow in self-pity or avoid accountability for her choices. Their sessions often left Jessica emotionally drained but also more clear-headed about the work she needed to do. Guilt and shame are appropriate responses to what you've done, Dr. Rodriguez explained during a joint session I attended with Jessica's permission. But they become destructive if they prevent you from taking constructive action to address the harm you've caused. How do I live with what I've done to people? Jessica asked. How do I face the clients whose money I stole, the trust I violated? By making amends wherever possible and ensuring it never happens again, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Recovery from this kind of crisis requires accepting responsibility without being paralyzed by it. The sessions also addressed Jessica's relationship with alcohol, which had clearly become problematic during her months of escalating financial stress. She wasn't technically an alcoholic, but she'd been using drinking as a way to avoid dealing with her mounting problems. Dr. Rodriguez recommended abstinence during the legal proceedings and ongoing monitoring to prevent future addiction issues. 3 weeks after Jessica's arrest, she finally called our parents directly to explain her situation. I sat with her during the call, providing moral support while she found the courage to tell Mom and Dad that their successful daughter was actually facing prison time for financial crimes. The conversation was heartbreaking to witness. Jessica's voice shook as she described the charges, the investigation, the media coverage that had made her a public example of real estate fraud. Mom cried throughout the call, while Dad asked practical questions about legal representation and financial planning. "We still love you," Mom said through her tears. "Nothing you've done changes that. We're disappointed and confused, but you're still our daughter. How can you still love me after this?" Jessica asked, echoing the question she'd posed to me weeks earlier. "Because love isn't conditional on success," Dad replied firmly. "We love you because you're family, not because of your job or your house or your bank account. Those things never mattered as much as you thought they did." The conversation marked a turning point in Jessica's recovery. For the first time since her arrest, she seemed to believe that her life had value beyond her professional achievements. The unconditional support from our parents gave her a foundation to build on, something stable that couldn't be taken away by legal proceedings or financial consequences. My own life during this period felt surreal. By day, I was excelling at Phoenix Digital Solutions, managing major campaigns and building my reputation as a rising star in the marketing industry. By evening, I was helping my sister navigate criminal proceedings and bankruptcy. The contrast between my professional success and my family crisis was jarring, but it also gave me perspective on what really mattered. David was incredibly supportive throughout this ordeal, though I could tell the stress was affecting our relationship. Our evenings together were often interrupted by crisis calls from Tom or Jessica, and my emotional energy was largely depleted by the time I got home from my daily visits to their house. "How are you holding up?" he asked one evening as we finally sat down to dinner at 9 p.m. after I'd spent 3 hours helping Jessica sort through legal documents. "I'm okay," I said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, no. I'm exhausted and emotionally drained, and I'm not sure how much longer I can maintain this pace." "What would happen if you stepped back a little?" David asked gently. "Let Jessica and Tom handle more of this themselves?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding. Jessica was clearly becoming dependent on my daily support and guidance, but that dependency might be preventing her from developing her own coping skills. At some point, she'd need to manage her recovery independently. "I think she'd fall apart," I admitted. "She's barely functioning as it is, and I'm not sure she has the emotional strength to handle this alone." "But you can't manage her life forever," David pointed out. "At some point, she has to take responsibility for her own recovery, just like you had to take responsibility for rebuilding after you lost your job." The comparison hit home. When I'd lost my position at TechFlow, I'd had to develop resilience and self-reliance to move forward. Jessica would eventually need to do the same, and my constant involvement might actually be hindering that process. The next morning, I had a difficult conversation with Jessica about establishing better boundaries around my support. She could call me once per day with updates or genuine emergencies, but she needed to start handling routine matters independently. I would still attend important meetings and provide emotional support, but she had to take primary responsibility for managing her legal and financial affairs. "Are you abandoning me?" Jessica asked, her voice small and frightened. "No," I said firmly. "I'm teaching you to stand on your own feet, which is what you're going to need to do eventually anyway. I'll still be here, but you have to stop depending on me to manage every detail of your life." The boundary setting was difficult but necessary. Jessica had become accustomed to my daily involvement, and stepping back forced her to engage more actively with her own recovery. She started taking initiative in conversations with her attorney, researching employment options for people with criminal records, and developing practical plans for life after the legal proceedings concluded. 2 months after her arrest, Jessica's plea negotiation reached a tentative agreement. She would plead guilty to reduced charges, serve 9 months in minimum security federal prison, pay full restitution to her victims, and serve 2 years of supervised probation after her release. It was better than the worst-case scenarios we'd feared, but it still meant nearly a year of incarceration and significant long-term consequences. "I can handle 9 months," Jessica said after Rebecca Santos explained the terms. 9 months is survivable. "It's not just about surviving," I reminded her. "You need to think about what kind of person you want to be when you get out. Prison should be time for reflection and planning, not just waiting for it to be over." Jessica nodded, and I could see she was already thinking ahead to her post-incarceration life. The woman who had been paralyzed by despair just months earlier was now making concrete plans for her future, limited though her options might be. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for early spring, which gave us several more months to prepare practically and emotionally for Jessica's incarceration. She would likely be assigned to a federal facility in Arizona or a neighboring state, close enough for family visits but far enough away to represent a complete break from her former life. During this waiting period, Jessica continued working with Dr. Rodriguez on processing the psychological aspects of her situation. She was developing insight into the personality traits and thought patterns that had led to her criminal behavior. The need for constant success, the inability to admit vulnerability, the tendency to take increasingly dangerous risks to maintain appearances. "I was so afraid of failing that I kept making choices that guaranteed much bigger failures," she observed during one of our conversations. "If I'd just admitted I was struggling and asked for help early on, none of this would have happened." It was true, but it was also a recognition that came too late to change anything. Jessica's pride and need for control had prevented her from seeking assistance when her problems were still manageable. Now she was facing consequences that would affect the rest of her life, all because she couldn't admit weakness or vulnerability when it mattered most. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Jessica's crisis had forced her to become dependent on family support, in ways she'd never experienced before, while my job loss had ultimately taught me self-reliance and resilience. Our situations had reversed completely, but the lessons we were learning were remarkably similar, that pride and independence can become destructive if they prevent us from accepting help when we need it most. As winter turned towards spring and Jessica's sentencing date approached, I reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning when I'd lost my job at TechFlow. The woman who had laughed at my unemployment was now facing prison time, while the woman who had been devastated by corporate layoffs was thriving professionally and personally. But the real transformation wasn't in our external circumstances. It was in our understanding of what family meant, what success actually looked like, and how quickly anyone's carefully constructed life could collapse without warning. Jessica's downfall had been more dramatic than my job loss, but both experiences had taught us that resilience comes from internal strength, not external achievements. The question now was whether Jessica would emerge from her legal consequences with the same hard-won wisdom that had carried me through my own crisis, or whether the magnitude of her failures would leave her permanently broken. That answer would have to wait until after her sentencing, after her time in prison, after she had the chance to rebuild her life from the ground up. Standing by her side through this process had been one of the most difficult things I'd ever done, but it had also taught me something important about forgiveness. Not just forgiving others for their failures, but forgiving ourselves for being imperfect humans who sometimes make terrible choices. Jessica's crimes were serious and her consequences were appropriate, but she was still my sister, still capable of redemption, still deserving of love even in her lowest moments. The woman who had refused to show me compassion during my crisis was slowly learning what compassion meant by receiving it from others during her own. Whether she would be able to extend that same grace to others in the future remained to be seen, but the foundation was being laid for a different kind of relationship between us, one based on mutual understanding of failure and recovery rather than competition and judgment. Jessica's sentencing hearing fell on a crisp April morning that felt more like winter than spring. I sat in the federal courthouse gallery wearing the same navy blazer I'd worn to job interviews a year earlier, watching my sister stand before Judge Harrison in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. The transformation from successful real estate agent to convicted felon was complete, documented in court records that would follow her for the rest of her life. Ms. Morgan, you have pleaded guilty to wire fraud and embezzlement involving approximately $400,000 in client funds, Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. These are serious crimes that violated the trust placed in you by your clients and damaged the integrity of the real estate profession in this community. Jessica stood perfectly still as the judge spoke, her back straight despite everything that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost 30 pounds since her arrest, and the institutional clothing hung loosely on her frame. But there was something different about her posture today, not the defeated slump of someone broken by consequences, but the quiet acceptance of someone who had finally stopped running from reality. Before I impose sentence, is there anything you would like to say to the court? Judge Harrison asked. Jessica stepped forward to the microphone, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded a handwritten statement. Your Honor, I want to apologize to the clients whose trust I violated, to the real estate community I brought shame upon, and to my family who has suffered because of my choices. There is no excuse for what I did. I allowed greed and desperation to override my moral compass, and I caused real harm to real people. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I know that words cannot undo the damage I've caused, but I want the court to know that I have used these past months to understand how I reached this point and to ensure I never make these kinds of choices again. I am committed to paying full restitution to every person I harmed, and I accept whatever consequences the court deems appropriate. The statement was powerful in its simplicity and directness. Gone was the Jessica who had always made excuses or rationalized her behavior. This version took full responsibility without deflection or minimization. Watching her speak, I felt something I hadn't expected. Genuine pride in her courage to face the consequences of her actions head-on. Judge Harrison reviewed the sentencing guidelines and victim impact statements before announcing his decision. Ms. Morgan, I am sentencing you to 12 months and 1 day in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $375,000 to be distributed among your victims according to the schedule prepared by the prosecution. 12 months was longer than the 9 months Rebecca Santos had hoped for, but it was still within the range we'd prepared for. Jessica received the sentence without visible reaction, though I saw her shoulders drop slightly as the reality of a full year in prison settled over her. Tom broke down, sobbing in the row behind me, the sound echoing through the formal courtroom. He'd been Jessica's anchor throughout the legal proceedings, liquidating their assets and managing the practical details while she focused on her emotional recovery. Now he faced a year of managing everything alone while she served her sentence. After the hearing, we had 15 minutes for goodbyes before Jessica would be transported to the federal facility in Tucson where she'd serve her time. The conversation felt surreal. How do you say goodbye to someone who won't be free for a full year? Someone whose life has been completely altered by their own choices? Take care of yourself, Jessica said to me, her voice steady despite the handcuffs that restricted her movement. And thank you for not giving up on me when I deserved it. Write to me, I replied, squeezing her shoulder, since hugging wasn't possible with the restraints. Let me know how you're doing, what you're learning, how you're growing. I will. And Myka? When I get out, I want to be someone different, someone who deserves your forgiveness. You already are, I said, meaning it completely. You just have to keep choosing to be that person every day. The drive home from the courthouse felt like returning from a funeral. The ending of Jessica's old life was complete, and whatever came next would be built from entirely different materials. Tom went back to the empty house in Paradise Valley that was scheduled for sale within the month. I returned to my apartment downtown, to my thriving career, to David's supportive embrace and the life I'd built from the ashes of my own professional crisis. Phoenix Digital Solutions had been understanding about my need for time off during Jessica's legal proceedings, but returning to normal work routines felt strange after months of crisis management. My campaigns were performing exceptionally well, and Maria had been hinting about additional promotion opportunities as the company expanded into new markets. You've handled an incredibly difficult family situation with remarkable grace, Maria told me during my performance review the week after Jessica's sentencing. That kind of resilience and composure under pressure is exactly what we need in senior leadership positions. The professional recognition felt meaningful, but it was also tinged with awareness of how different my circumstances were from Jessica's. While she was adapting to life in federal prison, I was being celebrated for my contributions to corporate success. The contrast was stark and sobering. David and I finally had space to focus on our relationship again, without the constant interruptions of legal crises and family emergencies. We started making plans that had been on hold for months: a vacation to Colorado, moving to a larger apartment, discussions about more serious commitment. The stability felt wonderful after so much uncertainty. "How are you processing everything that's happened?" David asked one evening as we cooked dinner together in my small kitchen. "Jessica's in prison, your family has been through hell, but you seem remarkably centered about it all." "I think I'm still figuring it out," I admitted, stirring pasta sauce while he chopped vegetables. "A year ago, I thought Jessica had everything figured out, and I was the family failure. Now our positions are completely reversed, but neither situation feels like the whole truth about who we are." "What do you mean?" "I mean that success and failure aren't as permanent or meaningful as we think they are. Jessica's achievements were built on fraud, so they weren't real. My job loss felt devastating, but it led me to better opportunities. Neither of our external circumstances reflected our actual worth as people." David nodded thoughtfully. "So what does reflect our worth? How we treat people when they're vulnerable. How we handle our own failures. Whether we're willing to help others even when they haven't helped us. The character stuff that doesn't show up on resumes or social media." The conversation crystallized something I'd been thinking about throughout Jessica's crisis. Her crimes were serious and her consequences were appropriate, but her willingness to accept responsibility and work toward making amends showed a capacity for growth that her years of apparent success had never revealed. Meanwhile, my professional achievements felt meaningful only because they were built on genuine skills and ethical choices. Jessica's first letter arrived 3 weeks after her sentencing, written in her careful handwriting on institutional stationery. The federal facility in Tucson was minimum security, more like a college campus than the prison most people imagined. She had a job in the library, was taking accounting classes, and had joined a support group for women dealing with addiction and criminal behavior. "The hardest part isn't the lack of freedom," she wrote. "It's sitting with the reality of what I did, without being able to escape into work or alcohol or shopping. I have to face myself here in ways I never did, on the outside. It's terrifying but also necessary." Her letters became a regular part of my routine, arriving every 2 weeks with updates on her progress and reflections on the choices that had led to her incarceration. The woman who had once been too proud to admit mistakes was now documenting her flaws and growth with brutal honesty. "I've been thinking about that day when you called me after losing your job," she wrote in her third letter. "I can see now that my reaction wasn't really about you at all. It was about my own fear of failure, my need to believe that success was just a matter of making the right choices. Your job loss threatened that belief, so I had to convince myself it was your fault somehow." Reading her analysis of that painful conversation felt like completing a puzzle I'd been working on for months. Jessica's cruelty during my crisis hadn't been personal. It had been self-protective, an attempt to maintain her illusion of control in an uncertain world. Understanding her motivation didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained it in ways that made forgiveness possible. Tom struggled significantly during Jessica's incarceration. He'd built his identity around being part of a successful power couple, and suddenly he was a single man living in a rental apartment while his wife served time for financial crimes. The social isolation was particularly difficult. Many of their former friends had distanced themselves after the scandal, leaving Tom to navigate his own recovery without his usual support network. "I never realized how much of our social life was built around Jessica's business connections," Tom confided during one of our monthly coffee meetings. "When that disappeared, I discovered we didn't have many genuine friendships left." I introduced Tom to some of my friends from TechFlow Solutions and encouraged him to pursue interests he'd neglected during the years of focus on Jessica's career. Slowly, he began building a life that wasn't dependent on external validation or social status. Like Jessica, he was learning hard lessons about what constituted authentic success versus mere appearances. My parents visited Jessica regularly, making the 3-hour drive to Tucson every month despite their own complicated emotions about her situation. Mom struggled with guilt about not recognizing the signs of Jessica's escalating problems, while Dad focused on practical matters like managing her financial obligations and maintaining family connections. "She seems different," Mom observed after one visit. "More grounded, more honest about her feelings. In some ways, she's more like the Jessica we knew as a child before she became so focused on achievement and appearances." It was an interesting observation. Prison had stripped away all the external markers Jessica had used to define herself: career, wealth, social status, control over her environment. What remained was the core person underneath those layers, someone who was apparently more authentic and self-aware than the successful real estate agent had ever been. 6 months into Jessica's sentence, I received an unexpected opportunity that would test everything I'd learned about success and family, loyalty. A major marketing firm in Denver had offered me a senior director position with a substantial salary increase and the chance to build their Southwest regional division from the ground up. It was the kind of career opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime, the chance to make a real mark in my industry. The timing was complicated. Jessica would be released in 6 months, and she'd need significant support during her transition back to civilian life. Tom was still struggling with his own recovery, and my parents were getting older and finding the monthly drives to Tucson increasingly difficult. Leaving Phoenix would mean abandoning my family during a critical period of rebuilding and healing. I discussed the opportunity with David, who encouraged me to seriously consider it despite the family complications. "You can't put your career on hold indefinitely because of Jessica's situation," he pointed out. "She made choices that led to consequences, but those consequences shouldn't control your life decisions." He was right, but the decision felt more complex than simple career advancement. Over the past year, I'd learned that family relationships required ongoing investment and presence, not just good intentions from a distance. Jessica's recovery would likely take years, not months, and my support during that process could make the difference between successful reintegration and continued struggles. I decided to be completely honest with Jessica about the opportunity rather than making the decision without her input. Her response, written from prison, surprised me with its clarity and selflessness. "Take the job," she wrote. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity you deserve, and you can't let my mistakes limit your possibilities. I've learned to stand on my own feet here, and I need to continue doing that when I get out. Your success isn't dependent on my failures, and my recovery isn't dependent on your proximity." Her encouragement felt genuine, but I also detected an undertone of something else. Perhaps relief at not having to depend on my ongoing support, or recognition that our relationship needed different boundaries than the crisis-driven dynamic we'd developed over the past year. After extensive discussions with David, my parents, and Tom, I decided to decline the Denver offer and accept a counteroffer from Phoenix Digital Solutions that would keep me in Arizona while still advancing my career significantly. The decision felt right for multiple reasons. It honored my family commitments while still pursuing professional growth, and it kept me in the city where I'd built a strong network and support system. Jessica's reaction to my decision was mixed. She appreciated my willingness to stay close during her transition, but she also worried that I was sacrificing opportunities because of misplaced guilt about her situation. "Promise me you're not staying because you feel responsible for my recovery," she wrote. "I need to know that you're making choices based on what's best for your life, not what you think I need from you." Her concern was valid and reflected significant personal growth. The Jessica who had entered prison a year earlier would have expected family members to reorganize their lives around her needs. This version was actively encouraging me to prioritize my own interests, even if they conflicted with her preferences. As Jessica's release date approached, we began planning for her reintegration into civilian life. She would stay with Tom temporarily while looking for employment and permanent housing, though their relationship remained uncertain. The shared trauma of her legal troubles had brought them closer in some ways, but had also revealed fundamental incompatibilities that might not survive her return to freedom. The job search was challenging, as Rebecca Santos had predicted. Jessica's felony conviction eliminated most traditional employment opportunities, particularly anything involving financial responsibility or professional licensing. She applied for positions in retail, food service, and customer service, jobs that would have been unthinkable during her real estate career, but now represented the realistic scope of her options. "I'm not too good for any honest work," Jessica wrote as her release date neared. "Pride and status consciousness got me into this mess. I'd rather stock shelves with integrity than run cons in corner offices." The sentiment reflected genuine transformation in her values and priorities. The woman who had once measured success exclusively through income and social recognition was now focused on rebuilding her life through ethical choices and authentic relationships, regardless of external appearances. 2 weeks before Jessica's scheduled release, Tom made a decision that surprised everyone. He filed for divorce, explaining that while he'd supported Jessica through her crisis out of love and loyalty, he couldn't envision rebuilding their marriage after everything that had happened. "We became different people over the past year," Tom explained to me over coffee. "I learned I could be happy with a simpler life, while Jessica is still figuring out who she wants to be. We're both growing, but we're growing in different directions." The divorce was amicable, but added another layer of complexity to Jessica's reintegration planning. She would need to find her own housing and support system, rather than returning to the familiar structure of her marriage. In some ways, this forced independence might be healthier for her recovery, but it also meant starting over with fewer resources and connections. Jessica's reaction to the divorce news was surprisingly calm. "I think Tom is right," she wrote. "We built our relationship around a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. It wouldn't be fair to either of us to try to pretend otherwise." Her acceptance of the divorce as a natural consequence of her transformation showed remarkable emotional maturity. The Jessica who had entered prison might have fought the dissolution or blamed Tom for abandoning her during difficult times. This version recognized that authentic relationships required honesty about who people actually were, not nostalgia for who they used to be. As I prepared for Jessica's return to Phoenix, I reflected on everything that had changed since that Tuesday morning when I'd lost my job at TechFlow. Both Jessica and I had experienced complete upheavals of our professional and personal lives, but our responses to those crises had been dramatically different. I'd learned resilience and self-reliance while building a stronger sense of my own worth beyond external achievements. Jessica had learned humility and accountability, while discovering that her value as a person wasn't dependent on her success as a professional. The sister who would walk out of federal prison in 2 weeks would be fundamentally different from the one who had laughed at my unemployment 15 months earlier. Whether that transformation would prove durable in the face of ongoing challenges remained to be seen, but the foundation had been laid for a different kind of relationship between us, one based on mutual understanding of failure and recovery rather than competition and judgment. The woman who had once dismissed my struggles as character failures was about to discover how difficult it was to rebuild a life from nothing. The difference was that this time, she wouldn't have to face those challenges alone. She'd have family members who understood that supporting someone through crisis wasn't about enabling their mistakes, but about providing stability while they learned to make better choices. Standing by Jessica during her darkest period had taught me as much about myself as it had about her. I'd learned that forgiveness wasn't about excusing harmful behavior, but about refusing to let someone else's failures define my own character. I discovered that true strength came not from avoiding vulnerability, but from choosing compassion, even when it wasn't deserved or reciprocated. The tables had turned completely since my job loss, but the real victory wasn't in Jessica's downfall or my professional success. It was in both of us learning that our worth as human beings transcended our external circumstances, and that family meant showing up for each other, especially when it was difficult and complicated and messy. That lesson would serve both of us well as we navigated whatever challenges lay ahead. Jessica walked out of the federal facility in Tucson wearing the same clothes she'd worn to her sentencing hearing a year earlier, though they hung differently on her now. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost during her crisis, but more importantly, she carried herself with a quiet confidence I'd never seen before. Not the brittle arrogance of her real estate days, but the steady presence of someone who had faced their worst fears and survived. I was waiting in the parking lot with David, both of us nervous about this reunion. A year of letters and supervised phone calls hadn't prepared us for seeing Jessica in person again, free but forever changed by her experience. When she spotted us, her smile was genuine but tentative, as if she wasn't sure she deserved such a warm welcome. "Hi," she said simply when she reached the car, and I hugged her for the first time since her arrest. She felt solid and real, no longer the fragile person who had nearly collapsed under the weight of her shame and consequences. "How does it feel?" David asked as we drove toward Phoenix, Jessica staring out the window at the Arizona landscape she hadn't seen unobstructed by prison fencing for 12 months. "Strange," Jessica admitted. "Everything looks the same, but I feel like I'm seeing it through completely different eyes. Like I'm a tourist in my own life." We'd arranged for Jessica to stay in a small apartment near downtown Phoenix, close enough to my place for support, but independent enough for her to rebuild her own identity. Tom had helped furnish it with basics before finalizing their divorce, a gesture of kindness that spoke well of both of them despite their marriage not surviving her crisis. Jessica's first weeks of freedom were challenging in ways that surprised all of us. The job applications she'd submitted from prison had yielded few responses, and those interviews she did get often ended abruptly once employers learned about her criminal record. The gap between her education and experience and the entry-level positions available to her created a unique form of professional whiplash. "I spent 15 years building expertise in real estate and finance," Jessica told me over coffee one morning, "and now I'm applying to stock shelves at grocery stores. It's humbling in ways I'm still processing." But what struck me most was her lack of bitterness about these limitations. The Jessica I'd known before prison would have raged against such circumstances, would have found ways to blame others or minimize her own responsibility. This version accepted her restricted options as natural consequences of her choices and focused on finding meaningful work within those constraints. She eventually found employment at a nonprofit organization that helped other formerly incarcerated individuals transition back to civilian life. The job paid a fraction of what she'd earned in real estate, but it utilized her organizational skills while serving a purpose larger than personal enrichment. "I understand what these people are going through," Jessica explained when she told me about the position. "I know what it feels like to have doors slammed shut because of past mistakes, to wonder if you'll ever be seen as more than your worst decisions." Watching Jessica work with other ex-offenders was revelatory. She brought patience and empathy to people society often dismissed, helping them navigate practical challenges like finding housing, employment, and healthcare, while dealing with the ongoing stigma of criminal records. Her own experience of losing everything made her credible in ways that traditional social workers sometimes weren't. 6 months after her release, Jessica and I finally had the conversation we'd been avoiding about that phone call when I'd lost my job. We were walking through the botanical garden downtown, a neutral space where difficult topics felt manageable. "I need to apologize properly for how I responded when you were unemployed," Jessica said, stopping beside a fountain to face me directly. "Not just because it was cruel, but because I understand now what it feels like to have your whole world collapse and need someone to see you as more than your failures." "I know," I said simply. "Your letters from prison already showed me that you understood. But I need to say it out loud, to your face," Jessica insisted. "I laughed at your pain because I was terrified of my own vulnerability. I needed to believe that bad things happen to people who made poor choices, because admitting that life could be random and unfair would have meant acknowledging how precarious my own success really was." Her analysis was accurate but also incomplete. "It wasn't just about fear," I added gently. "It was also about needing to maintain your position as the successful sister. My struggles validated your choices, while my potential success threatened your narrative about being the responsible one." Jessica nodded, tears starting to flow. "Yes. And I'm sorry for making you carry that burden, for turning your crisis into something about me and my ego." "I forgive you," I said, meaning it completely. "I forgave you a long time ago, actually. Watching you take responsibility for your mistakes and work to become better taught me more about character than your apology ever could." The conversation felt like completing a circle that had been broken for nearly 2 years. We were both different people now. I was more confident and self-assured, while Jessica was more humble and empathetic. Our relationship would never return to what it had been before, but it was evolving into something potentially stronger and more authentic. A year after Jessica's release, I received a promotion to Regional Marketing Director for Phoenix Digital Solutions, a position that came with significant responsibility and the opportunity to mentor younger professionals. During my acceptance speech at the company celebration, I found myself thinking about second chances and the difference between temporary setbacks and permanent failures. Jessica had been promoted to program coordinator at the nonprofit where she worked. She was developing new initiatives to help formerly incarcerated women find stable employment and housing, drawing on her own experience to create more effective support systems. Her work was featured in a local newspaper article about innovative approaches to criminal justice reform. "Look at us," Jessica said when we met for dinner to celebrate both promotions. "A year ago, people would have said you were the success story and I was the cautionary tale. Now we're both building something meaningful, just in different ways." She was right. The external markers of our lives, my corporate success, her nonprofit work, mattered less than the internal changes we'd both undergone. I'd learned that professional achievement without personal integrity was hollow, while Jessica had discovered that meaningful work didn't require high status or income. David and I got engaged that spring, with Jessica serving as my maid of honor despite everything that had happened between us. At our engagement party, she gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. 2 years ago, I was convinced that success meant having more than everyone else, Jessica said, raising her glass. I thought my worth was measured by my income, my house, my professional reputation. Myka knew better even then, but I was too proud to learn from her example. She paused, looking directly at me. My sister taught me that real success means showing up for people when they need you, especially when it's difficult. She taught me that forgiveness isn't something you earn, it's something you choose to give. And she showed me that who you are during your worst moments matters more than who you are during your best ones. The toast captured something essential about what we'd both learned through our respective crises. External circumstances, job loss, criminal charges, financial ruin, were temporary conditions that didn't define our fundamental worth as human beings. What mattered was how we responded to those circumstances, how we treated others during difficult times, and whether we used our experiences to become more compassionate people. Today, 3 years after that devastating phone call when Jessica laughed at my unemployment, our relationship is stronger than it's ever been. Not because we've forgotten what happened, but because we've both grown into people capable of handling conflict and forgiveness with maturity. Jessica still works at the nonprofit, where she's become a respected advocate for criminal justice reform. She speaks at conferences about the challenges facing formerly incarcerated individuals and the importance of second chances. Her work has given her a sense of purpose that her real estate success never provided. I've continued advancing at Phoenix Digital Solutions while maintaining the work-life balance that allows me to nurture relationships and personal growth alongside professional achievement. The lesson I learned during my own crisis, that identity can't be built solely on external accomplishments, continues to guide my choices. We both understand now that the tables didn't really turn between us. There was no winner or loser in our respective struggles. No cosmic justice in Jessica's downfall following her cruelty toward me. What happened was that 2 imperfect people learned hard lessons about resilience, accountability, and the true meaning of success. The sister who laughed when I lost my job taught me, through her own spectacular failure and subsequent recovery, that everyone deserves compassion during their darkest moments. And when she lost everything, I chose to be there for her, not because she'd earned it, but because that's who I wanted to be regardless of how others had treated me. Sometimes the most important victories aren't about proving we were right or watching others fail. Sometimes they're about choosing love over resentment, growth over bitterness, and connection over competition. In the end, that choice made both of us stronger than either success or failure ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.